Good afternoon, and welcome to Advancement Live, the weekly web show for college advancement professionals. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live Network, a product of ED Universe Media. Tune in to Advancement Live on Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on higheredlive.com and join in the conversation on Twitter using the Advancement Live hashtag. For today only, since we're having some technical issues with the widget, we will be using the Higher Ed Live hashtag for this show. I'm your host for today's show, Andrew Gosen. My co-host, Ryan Catherwood, is off this week. This afternoon, I am joined by Joe Lyons, Senior Director of the Cornell Annual Fund, and Devin Mathias, Consultant at Marts and Lundy. In just a moment, we will be chatting about the Annual Fund year that just concluded, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsor who made Advancement Live possible. Today's show is sponsored by iModules. iModules is the leading constituent engagement management provider for educational institutions. iModules delivers an integrated online platform that transforms how institutions strengthen constituent relationships and achieve fundraising success. I had a chance to talk to Fred Weiss, the president of iModules, in San Francisco last week at the CASE Summit, and it was great to share perspectives on how shows like this one can facilitate interesting conversations about institutional advancement. I thanked him for his interest in person, and I'll do it again now. Fred, thanks for supporting Advancement Live. We couldn't do this without iModules. So now on to our show. It's getting on in July. Many annual giving campaigns closed their books on fiscal year 13 on June 30th. In today's show, we're going to take a look back at high points from the past year, challenges and opportunities for the coming year, and broader trends that we should be keeping an eye on. My guests today bring a wealth of experience and perspective to this conversation. Today's first guest is Joe Lyons. Joe has worked for Cornell's Division of Alumni Affairs and Development for 11 years and currently is the Senior Director of the Cornell Annual Fund. He has served in this role since 2010 and is responsible for the overall strategy and management of the annual giving program, including all of its component programs: reunion campaigns, Parents Annual Fund, Regional Annual Fund, Marketing and Donor Participation, and Leadership Annual Giving. In his role, Joe is also responsible for building partnerships across the Division of Alumni Affairs and Development in support of unrestricted giving, annual giving, donor development, and volunteer development. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andrew. Happy to be here today.
So, Joe, the FY13 Annual Fund campaign closed about 3 weeks ago. I know that you and your team are still sifting through the numbers, but in general, how did things go?
We actually had a great year this year. It was good to see and exciting to see. It takes a little while for us to see all the gifts hit the system and be able to actually measure, but we had a record year for the Cornell Annual Fund in unrestricted giving, both in dollars and donors. It's our 11th consecutive year of growth, and we also saw a reversal in the trend of declining participation this year, and actually saw a very nice boost in participation amongst our undergraduates by 6%, our graduate and professional alumni, as well as our parents. So we're pretty pleased.
That is great to hear. What are one or two things that you think worked particularly well?
For us, one thing I would definitely include would be the fact that after some time, some planning, we were able to launch a new giving society focused on loyal giving and consecutive year giving. So our 1865 Society went live this year. It focuses on recognizing donors who have given 2 or more consecutive years, and we rolled that out this spring. The response has been very positive and actually has helped to I attribute most of our growth participation-wise has come from the launch of that society. And I think for our broad-based donors especially, who perhaps were below some of the other giving society levels, the feedback has been very positive, that the university is showing that it is that loyalty at any level is something that we value. So that was an exciting development for us and key to our success. And we were able to try a few new things, did some more A/B testing this year, started to do some second asks, which we hadn't done a lot of before, and saw good success there. So we're going to look forward to building on it in the year ahead.
Joe, thank you. So let's move on to our second guest, Devin Mathias. Devin has worked at Marts and Lundy since 2011, focusing on the development of annual giving programs, young alumni efforts, donor relations, capital campaigns, and the integration of social media into comprehensive fundraising programs. Prior to moving into the world of consulting, Devin spent 3 years as Director of Annual Giving at the University of Michigan and 5 years at the University of Florida Foundation. Devin has also worked with Penn State's Office of Annual Giving and the Affinity Connection, a private alumni relations firm. Devin, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So Devin, working in the consulting space as you do, you're interacting with a wide range of clients. What's your sense of the overall performance of annual giving programs in higher education this year?
It's continuing what we've seen as a recent trend of where a lot of places the dollars are up either slightly or significantly and the donors are slightly down. That said, there's general and genuine optimism I see throughout the industry that there's potential to do well exists again, whereas a few years ago there was a lot of just general pessimism about the field. Let's say like challenges in general, the kind of threefold: a struggle to allocate resources because they're so limited. Real challenge that I see is finding qualified professionals for vacancies. A lot of places are struggling to find good people, and lacking research to make their decisions in general.
I'm interested in your comment about the difficulty finding good people. I've had this conversation a number of times, especially when dealing with people who are interested in Anglo-American advancement models in the Pacific Rim areas, talking about the balance between finding people with experience versus finding people with the right basic skill set and then teaching them advancement. Do you have a perspective on that?
I've had a lot of conversations where I'm trying to I don't want to tell people to just go away from what we've been doing and that development or advancement experience is to be ignored, but to be, and I hate the phrase thinking outside the box, but I will use it here, where it's you're willing to look at somebody with marketing skills more than you're necessarily looking for development skills. One thing that I'm constantly preaching, and I am seeing more and more places do, and they're succeeding with, is that marketing is not a dirty word when it comes to development and fundraising. I've had a few vice presidents in higher education I've worked with where when I brought up the idea of, and they're looking to hire either a leader or for annual giving or an AVP that will oversee it, where we start talking about, okay, if we break down the talents we need here and then compare it to a solid marketing professional, it's really what you need. And a few of these vice presidents have gotten very excited about it, and there's one in particular where we just brought a guy in probably 2 months ago with strictly a marketing background, and he is, the plan he's put together and he's hitting the ground running. It's so much stronger than a lot of what you'd see a lot of places where you go through that standard. Okay, we're going to bring up the assistant director of annual giving and hope they can tackle it. It's a more of a, I guess, a business style approach instead of just doing the same old.
Right. So one thing that we've heard a lot about over the past year has been the need for innovation in higher education. And I'm wondering if from your 30,000-foot perspective, are you seeing any innovative approaches to annual giving that seem to be working effectively across multiple institutions?
I'm seeing some. I will say, I have to give a disclaimer, though, on this, that I see a lot of people looking for the innovative that aren't doing what my old VP, who's now VP at Michigan State, Bob Groves, used to say, who aren't doing the blocking and tackling right. So I do like to just preface this by saying, make sure that you're doing the basics right first, because there are a lot of places that want to do the shiny new toy and and worry about that. But beyond that, in terms of innovation, I think places that are looking at the mini campaigns are doing well. That will somewhat mirror what we're seeing more and more of the community fundraising, where they have a philanthropy day, etc., where you can do something like that, and we create that urgency and those deadlines that we don't often have in higher education. The end of calendar year is great, as we know. A lot of gifts come in then. We try often in higher education to make the end of the fiscal year important to our donors when it so often is not. But when you've got some of these more mini campaigns, and you can, and of course promoting them socially, etc., and of course I'm biased towards the University of Florida, having done work there and studied there, but their Get Up and Give campaign is great, and it works successfully in terms of giving people just basically this time of year that they wanted people to give, and they got more gifts and more donors than they had historically through that program. So that's just one.
Great. That actually, your comments about blocking and tackling transitions us nicely into the second phase of the show. Let's shift gears now and focus a little bit on specific fundraising practices. Annual giving shops have traditionally relied primarily on direct mail and phonathons and techniques of that sort, but that landscape changed first with the arrival of email and then more recently with the arrival of social media. So let's tackle each of these in turn. Devin, what's your take on direct mail? Is it still viable?
I think it's still viable, and I think it's still critical. I think there's an audience there that you need to hit through it. I just think you need to be smart. I am seeing places where there's still leaders that are dictating, okay, we need to go out with a direct mail appeal to everyone. There'll be presidents of universities saying, yeah, we need to mail everyone just to make sure we touch them somehow. From a president's point of view, I can get that to a degree, and that you want to say you tried everyone. But from a resource allocation point of view, I'm a little concerned about that. More specifically, I think that direct mail for various audiences, if you just need to approach them differently, and obviously do your homework in advance. The higher end donors, almost every higher ed institution. I've never worked with one that said we've got way too many resources right now. We don't know what to do with them. So if you can, often I'd say 75% of the institutions, there's a gap between the best annual giving donors and the worst major gift donors in the gift officer's eyes, where people often get lost. And there's something to be said for a higher end mail appeal in that audience, where you want to make sure they're still getting appeals and they're not just kind of falling off between annual giving and major giving. And then I'd also say I actually still I think there's actually room to do some good direct mail with the younger audiences, only because they're getting so little mail in many cases that you can actually stand out more in that regard, which I never thought I'd be saying. But a lot of places are just doing email, or social with that group, and there's something to be said. Even though they may only go to their mailbox once a week, if you can be something that jumps out, that may help you out.
So Joe, how does that match up with your experience at Cornell?
Very consistently. I often hear the speculation that direct mail is a thing of the past, and the reality is it still is brings in a lot of the dollars and donors that we rely on. It's critical. I mean, we're talking over $8 million, 15,000 donors, and these are things that simply can't be replaced at the moment with other channels. And I would speculate that a lot of the growth in online giving is being driven by direct mail. Not all of it is being driven by email. It's people who get their pledge card in the mail, put it in their stack of bills, and when they get to that moment in time, they go online to make their gift. And I can see that even from the day our mailings hit the mailboxes. You see the online giving page go up in donors. And people hold on to them, too. There's a stickiness to mailings that's hard to match with other media. People will hold on to their pledge card for months before they send it back in. So I would agree with Devin. I mean, you have to make smart choices about where you invest, and where, it's not going to be a particularly effective tool with converting non-donors. It's not going to make the case to them. That's probably not a good use of it. But for those who have made a decision to support your institution or are fans of your institution, it can be an effective and inexpensive method to be able to go to reach out to them. So it's still just it's certainly critical for us, and I think will continue to be for many institutions.
So Joe, let's move on to phonathons. We keep hearing that phonathons are being complicated by shifts in audience behavior. For instance, increasing numbers of people are abandoning their landlines and going cell phone only or moving to VoIP, which poses a challenge then if we don't have their cell phone numbers or a way to communicate with them on Skype. Other people are screening their calls more aggressively, Is this having an impact on phonathon results?
Yes, I would say it is. I mean, it's become harder to contact individuals through our phoning program, and that's something that we continue to struggle with. We personally want to do more around trying to find ways to increase the amount of cell phone information that we have, and be more aggressive in that. But we also continue to still see it play an important role in our program. Many people think it's on the horizon to disappear within the next year or two. I can't envision that when that gives an opportunity for our students to talk to 25,000 or more alumni parents and friends, and to have a personal connection, whether it results in a gift or not, to raise $1 million+ from 7,000-8,000 donors. Our credit card rate continues to be strong, despite some thinking that it would go down because of people's concerns with phishing. But we, for us, that's going to be hard to replace. I mean, it's a personal connection and outreach in our business that it would have to slide an awful far way before it's not a viable tool.
Devin, how do phonathons appear to be working from your perspective?
I think that could be echoed across the country, everything Joe just said. I've heard for 10 years that phonathon's going to be gone in a year, so obviously that's not happening, or at least for the last 9 years it's been wrong. And there's still, to this day, there's no better way to get non-donors on board. Of course, it's hard to get a hold of people, and there are challenges associated with it, but it's not going away. You have to be able to think about how can you approach, and are you identifying cell phones in your database? A lot of places, unfortunately, when cell phones first started coming around, just put them into home numbers or office numbers or other fields, as opposed to identifying them actually as mobile numbers. If you can get them identified as mobile in your system, then you can be more strategic about how you contact those folks. Can you send a text message in advance that says, hey, we're going to call you next week? Which, granted, that may mean they don't answer at all, but at least it's saving you some resources and maybe saving you a little ill will with the fact you're calling their cell phone.
Have either of you encountered any sort of pushback from people who don't want to be called on the cell phones?
Oh yeah, but I honestly, I don't have research to support this. This is simply my opinion, but I think that's not unlike people that would argue whatever reason. Oh, you called me during dinner, you called me during the Super Bowl, whatever it was. I mean, if they don't want to give, that's more likely just to be their reason or excuse at that moment not to give, as opposed to they're truly being so upset about calling their cell phone. I mean, very, very few people are counting their minutes on their cell phone as they were, a decade or two ago. So I think that's less of an issue. My bigger concern with calling cell phones is you've got a Boston number and I'm calling you and you're in Singapore. What's happening there in terms of connections, etc., and waking you up or whatever it may be. That's my bigger issue.
Well, I'm certainly grateful not to have to be counting minutes anymore.
Yes.
Joe, how about you?
No, I would agree with Devin. I think that we have not gotten pushback about cell phones except in those wrong time zone instances, which is a bit challenging. But I think there's value in even the fact that our name is showing up on people's caller ID. It's another trigger in a multiple array of channels to see Cornell University. And for some, it may not be positive, but for many, it is a reminder. And even our young alumni, I mean, when I look at our young alumni donor numbers, we're still getting a really good chunk. In fact, the strongest number of donors is coming still through phoning channels. Either ours or our athletic program has a phoning effort as well, and that's amongst our young alumni. So, I think it will continue.
So, Devin, you mentioned email campaigns being used heavily, especially with younger alumni. What's your take on email? Is it a spam issue? Is it a core competency that we all need to get better at? Or is it a secret weapon?
Well, can I be terrible and go back to that last question for just a second?
You sure can. Go right ahead.
I do want to note that leaving voicemails and leaving answering machine messages was something we rarely did when I was over phone programs, except for if we were calling parents, just so they weren't scared of getting a call from the institution. But I found now that it's almost like a pre-call or call, like because you are more likely to get screened. That leaving that message and saying, this is the University of wherever, we're calling you, we'll try you again, can help you get through. And actually, I think using the phone program just for stewardship is because you've got these resources, like you've got the phone program, you're not getting it through to as many people. So if you can use that to call people and say thanks, even if it's a month after they made their gift or a month before you're going to ask them again, that can help kind of disarm the phone as a channel with that audience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, anyway, on to email.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Sure.
About Phony 2 is it's trying to find the right places to use it. We've actually started to use it around Second Ask outreach this year, and our phoners were not happy and not welcoming of that concept, since they were so trained to the idea of a big part of their case is about make your gift this year and then you're somewhat off the hook. And they actually were surprised. We had great success being able to use it in that way. So it's not the traditional model, but we called back people we reached in the fall, and we actually had extremely high pledge rates and people doubling their gift when we called them. So I think it's also thinking about how best to use those programs around initiatives like that. Sorry, back to you, Devin.
Andrew, Joe, and I are just kicking you out at this point. We're just
That's fine. We're a self-hosting show. I like that.
So the question was, is email spam core competency or a secret weapon? I definitely think it's in that middle group. It's a core competency. It's another channel that we have to work into our marketing. I think there are nonprofits that spam. There's no doubt about it. I don't see it as much in higher ed as I see it elsewhere. I think that it's not a secret weapon in any way, shape, or form. In terms of the historical, like, is it going to solve all my problems, make gifts fall from the heavens, that kind of secret weapon. There are certainly audiences that are more responsive to it, but I think it's something that I'm shocked to this day how often I go to places, and I know we're going to get to social too, but where there's a mail campaign, there's a phone campaign, there's an email campaign, and there's a mail campaign, and that's just the fundraising part. And then there's the same thing for general communications, same thing for stewardship, same thing for planned giving, and none of these channels are talking to each other or really thinking about how they impact each other. Email is another core competency that needs to be integrated with the rest of your plan.
I really like the emphasis on integration. That seems to be something that collectively, as higher ed professionals, we have a hard time doing because it requires us to play nicely in the sandbox with others, and that's not always the easiest thing to do. So, Joe, how did Cornell do with email campaigns this year?
We saw good growth with it. I mean, we tried to be more aggressive than we've been in the past. We've tried to, we used it heavily around the launch of the 1865 Loyal Giving Society. Tried to be more graphic in our approach. We tried more frequent messages, especially in the last week of the fiscal year, and had some of our biggest, by far the biggest results we've had to date and highest responses. I think we still have room to be more aggressive. I think we want to shift and focus on mini campaigns, to Devin's point earlier, and where we can use email to do that or use social to do that. But I was pleased to see more growth there. It still does. It's only a piece of the pie, but it's becoming a more important piece of the pie. And I think our efforts too. I know we want to look at how to integrate our digital strategy, not just within our offices, but elsewhere in our division, because I think the struggle is going to be the feedback we get from some of our constituents that, as an institution, we're emailing too much. I personally think people have a high tolerance. I think about, if I get a lot of emails from an organization in my inbox, if it's an organization I'm a fan of, if I am interested, I may not read them all, but I'll delete them. I don't usually unsubscribe, and I think that's true of our alumni too. And sometimes you need to send more to try to be able to catch one that they pay attention to.
So let's shift gears now and sort of wrap up the discussion of media and techniques and talk about social media. As somebody who works in the social media space myself, my sense is that, well, there are some promising experiments that are unfolding in various institutions. We probably still haven't really cracked the nut of social media as an effective direct solicitation tool. We're using it effectively for some engagement strategies that support annual giving, both solicitations and stewardship. But it doesn't feel to me like it's yet ready for prime time in terms of a medium for making asks. Joe, what's your take on this? Do you think social media will ever be ready for prime time?
I don't know. Perhaps, we'll see the ways that some of our efforts, which we can touch on later around crowdsourcing, may impact it. But it's been very hard. It's something for us that's challenging because you can't target it in the way that so many of our other initiatives are used to targeting. We're able to normally focus and segment, and that's harder to do through some of the social media channels or to measure the results of it. When we've done things on Facebook, we've seen growth in the results, but it's from a very tiny amount to a little bit more. So I think it's going to be a more important part of the stewardship, education, cultivation part of the experience for a donor, and perhaps around some mini campaigns. But I don't know if it'll ever really emerge as a major solicitation tool.
Yeah, I think there's a cultural dimension to this, in that if you look at data about why people are using the social networks, by and large they're there for family and friends. Mm-hmm. And our institution's presence within that space, especially if we're being pretty direct and aggressive about asking for money, is a little bit at odds with why they're there to start with. So I feel like on one level we need to be sensitive to that and perhaps back off if we feel like we're being intrusive or aggressive in a way that's not right for the space. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of people are still getting used to social media and what they can accomplish while they're there in that particular space, and that over time cultural attitudes may evolve a little bit. I'm also consistently interested by the notion of targeting, in that on one level it's nice for us to be able to segment audiences according to our criteria. It feels to me like one of the potential opportunities that is opened up to us by the existence of social media is that if we can enlist our followers, our fans, members of our groups in helping us reach out to their networks, they can reach out according to criteria that are relevant to their networks. It's sort of a more donor-centric approach to segmentation, and that their segment is their social graph. And I'm looking at tools like Social Toaster, for instance, and I'm very excited by the potential that I see out there of getting people to agree to give not just time, talent, and treasure to the alma mater, but also their networks. But that was sort of a cul-de-sac I ran down there for a second. Devin, how about you? What's your take on social media? Do you think it's ever going to be ready for prime time?
I think you guys, both made great points. I think it's going to be ready for prime time. I just think we have to redefine what prime time is for social media. Like, it's not going to be our same old, same old. I think that one of the biggest challenges we face is that even to this day, when we ask someone to give online, even if it's through email or just on our websites, all too often we've got 38 steps they need to go through to fulfill that gift on whatever website. So with how quick interactions can be on social channels and how easy they need to be and how they're built on just people you trust and being able to do something easily and quickly, we can't say, step A is here, and then they go, and then they have to complete steps B through Z to do whatever we want them to. I don't know if I'm wording this right, but I think too often we're trying to kind of squeeze the social world into our historical online giving box, and they don't necessarily work perfectly together. I think that it's an area that's still great for stewardship, illustrating impact to audiences that wouldn't normally know, like, what their gift is doing, to track people, and as we've talked about in the past, in terms of helping development shops identify wealthy folks they may not have known were wealthy before. I know we're talking about social, and for most people listening, their minds immediately go to Facebook and Twitter and maybe YouTube, but I still think LinkedIn is so prime for finding wealthy donors for our leadership annual giving officers, and in even some cases our major gift officers. So in many ways, I think that that's on the cusp of being ready for prime time, if not already there.
I'm realizing now as I hear us talking that even the sort of metaphorical construct of being ready for prime time
Yes.
That's a pre-digital construct, right? Because in a world of DVRs, the whole notion of primetime doesn't make any sense anymore. And it occurs to me that that's actually a pretty provocative idea, right? We're used to the notion of something being ready for us to present to an audience when we're ready for it.
Yep.
But given that the whole revolution with cable TV and internet TV has to do with people being able to view on demand exactly what they want when they want it, it raises the specter of what would a donor-centric on-demand fundraising opportunity look like. And culturally, is that where we're going to have to head, whether we like it or not, simply because that's how the audience is increasingly interacting with the world?
Yeah, I'm going to start saying, are we ready for 8-track?
Yeah.
But no, I think that's a really, really great point, that we need to be ready whenever they are.
I think to some extent it comes down to, I do think we have to be trying new things. We have to be ready when they are. I think it's more from a practical standpoint of the expectations of the results in the short term or the near term, and I think that a challenge that probably a lot of annual fund directors, annual giving directors faces from trustees, administration, or otherwise very, very high expectations about what it will yield in the short term, and I think it's a long-term game. I think that we may not see on the gift side results right away, but we do need to continue to make headway and communicate on the terms of our alumni, parents, and friends.
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to take a moment to highlight a comment that was just made on the back channel here from Lori Packer. Her comment was, so advancement offices are siloed within advancement offices? How the heck do they work with communication, student life, and alumni? And the answer to that, from my perspective anyway, is with lots of effort and occasionally very painfully. But I don't think anybody would dispute that we need to get better at that.
Yeah, if at all, too, let's be honest.
If at all, exactly. So let's move on now to talking about the upcoming year and the future in general. One of the developments that I've been most excited about over the past 2 or 3 years is the emergence of crowdfunding platforms such as Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and Donors Choose. The consulting firm Massolution recently projected that donation-based crowdfunding platforms will generate $1.4 billion in gifts in 2013. And since the crowdfunding model is based on the goal of gifts that are more moderate in size but in greater numbers, this is operating at gift levels that are usually the domain of annual giving in higher education. However, since crowdfunding is based on the support of particular projects, it's in some ways directly antithetical to the mission of raising unrestricted dollars that's been for so long at the core of many annual giving programs. Do you guys feel that the emergence of crowdfunding is a threat to annual giving programs, or is it an opportunity, or a complement, or is it too early to tell? Devin, how about you?
I think it's going to depend on the program because it can be all the above. I think programs, there are places to this day that are, I say places, I'm speaking more about leadership in places where it is, we will only focus on unrestricted. We cannot focus on anything else. And there are places with traditions and histories where maybe that'll work, but it's very, institution-centric as opposed to donor-centric, and really it's somewhat behind. If you're an institution like that, then yes, this is going to be a threat in that you've got not unlike the local mom and pop nonprofits that are more willing to, show you what your dollars can do and put them where you want them to go. But that being said, places that are willing to embrace it and are willing to let donors give wherever's best for them. It's a total compliment and an opportunity to better engage folks. One of my favorite examples, I'm blanking on the name of the place, and Andrew, you've probably heard me talk about it before, is at the University of Texas at Austin. They have, what's the Ransom Center, where they house the costumes from Gone with the Wind. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is a few years back now, but I love this, and that because the anniversary of the movie was coming up, they put a campaign out there that they wanted to restore these costumes. And this was before the phrase crowdfunding was really used universally, but it's basically what it became. They had a deadline, they had a very unique fundraising opportunity, and it took off, and people were willing to fund it from around the globe. Granted, not everybody has costumes from an iconic movie, but we all have different things that push various donors' buttons and that get their passion flowing. So I think that's where the opportunity really lies.
I love that example and the notion of being able to fundraise on a truly global basis. And part of this, it stems back to a conversation I had with the executive director at UConn about 2 years ago, and the question of whether or not many of the practices that we view as our bread and butter are historical artifacts in the sense that they worked efficiently and they made lots of sense institutionally when they were implemented, but the world may have changed a little bit. And where I'm going with that is that arguably the analogy here is educational travel programs. Travel vendors like to work with alumni associations because the alumni affinity makes marketing of these programs substantially more efficient than it is when they're going out to the general public.
Yep.
And I've sort of been wondering in passing if obviously you want to make giving opportunities available to your alumni base because they're part of the institutional community, and of course you want to keep them involved. But do we need to expand our horizons about who we target with giving opportunities now that we can truly reach out to people on a global basis? Simply because we historically have focused on alumni, parents, and friends doesn't mean we're always limited to that.
I think there's no doubt. I think, like, particularly the more robust, large institutions where you've got health centers involved, you've got prominent museums involved, and even with athletics, etc., you've got people that these things impact that are interested in them. And then when you bring in research, you open up new audiences that are, ripe for your engagement and interaction and eventually solicitation.
So, Joe, what's your take on this? Your team has been involved in the launch of Cornell's crowdfunding pilot program with USEED.
I think that the story hasn't yet been written on this. I think there's a lot to still figure out. I think there's a lot of ways that the concept can help us to do more and to reach higher. My hope is that it's going to help us to engage those who haven't been engaged yet in giving, to reach out to those audiences that haven't responded to the other channels. I also hope we can find the ways to make it incremental and complementary. I don't think this is going to replace the other modes of giving, and I don't think we want it to either, because the university, most universities do need revenue that's flexible. They do need higher revenue gifts as well than some of these channels may bring in. So I think it's going to be up to us to try to work through those bumps in the road to find a way to make it another part of the annual giving arsenal, if you will. It is definitely at odds. As someone who's both charged with driving unrestricted giving as well as annual giving, it's a bit at odds with that, but I appreciate the partnership with all of those involved in the team here to try to find ways to make it be helpful and letting all boats rise. I think the implications of how it could change how we think about stewardship at institutions like ours, there's great potential there in finding ways similar that are used for crowdfunding that could help us to change how we steward and thank our donors, and I hope that we can learn some lessons from that. So I'm optimistic. I really do hope we'll see that it's going to help us to engage new donors. My hope is it's not an end in and of itself. I think for it to be successful, it has to be a gateway to giving elsewhere at the institution, and if we find that it's an end in and of itself, that could be a problem in the future.
I think another reason that it's important for institutions to at least acknowledge that this is happening and think about how we could develop our own best practices and identify the ways in which it makes sense to deploy it is that if you look at the development of phenomena like MOOCs, the massively open online courses, so the iconic course from Stanford, right? It had 160,000 people around the world sign up for the MOOC. And I've been in some interesting conversations where you ask yourselves the questions, okay, these people took a course with a professor, and to be sure, they aren't getting credit for it, but they have had an intellectual experience with the institution, and arguably you could consider that they might be some sort of an alum, right? There's a relationship between that individual and the institution that gave them the educational experience that they had. And you've got some old school alumni professionals who immediately say, well, it will be a cold day in hell before we ever give that person any sort of status with the institution, because that would devalue the brand and it would upset people and it would compromise the exclusivity and so on and so forth. But then there's part of me that says, okay, so that's 160,000 people, right? And we're beginning to see tools emerge like crowdfunding platforms that would make it possible to solicit that type of a crowd, in that it's scaled for crowds. You could solicit 160,000 as easily as you could solicit 1,600. And it is optimized for online interaction. And by definition, all of these people, because they took the Coursera course, they spend a lot of time online and they're comfortable interacting online. So I just ask myself, okay, so if 1% of those 160,000 people could be persuaded to give using a tool like a crowdfunding platform, you may still be way ahead of where you would be otherwise if you can get them to give at a sort of modest gift level. And it just feels to me like there are some interesting intersections here that are interesting enough that it's self-defeating to just dismiss them out of hand.
You know, I don't disagree with that. I think that there is a lot of potential that this could have an impact. I think it's going to be trying to find the best way to do it, and in a way that's relevant to our alumni or our donors, or hopefully, as you said, in a way that expands our audience, not just limited to our traditional set. I think that's the goal, and I think it's going to be whether or not we can recreate. I think it could be challenging to recreate some of the urgency that happen in places on sites like Kickstarter or Donors Choose at an institution of our size. So I think we're going to have to think creatively of how to create some of that urgency of where it really does rely on people to make or break something.
Devin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to add, like, just a challenge that comes to mind with it all is that I think there's so much potential here. And with regards to the Stanford example, I'd be all about going after those people. My big challenge is it's somewhat like, I mean, if we want to go back a couple decades and public broadcasting was doing a better job at getting donors in than higher ed was in a lot of cases, and it's because you were getting, you know, a coffee mug and this and that whenever you gave to PBS. There's something somewhat parallel now going on with you go to Kickstarter and you're getting a DVD or an album or whatever it may be associated with funding a project. And one of my concerns is, as we get donors into and we create these crowdfunding models, like, are they going to expect something similar in return every time they give? And maybe this is just me being anxious about it. I could be way off here. And does that then create this habit of needing something in return for their philanthropic support? And then, as an institution, do we need to have the conversation of, is that okay? Like, are we all right with that being the relationship we have going forward, even though it's kind of counter to what we've done for so many years of saying, you know, we want your entirely potentially tax-deductible gift to be represented in your gift. We're not going to take anything off. We're not going to give you any charge fees. Like, it's just one issue that, I mean, it's not keeping me up at night, but I worry about it in terms of doing it right with regards to crowdfunding in the higher ed spectrum.
I think you're absolutely right to be nervous about the rewards model. And in my mind, the real danger there is that if you head in that direction, you're getting into the fulfillment business. Yeah. And especially if you scale, that's going to just take a lot of manpower to be able to handle. But at the same time, it feels to me like that's a potential opportunity to make your research and what your students and faculty are doing engaging in a way that's a little bit unique. And I've actually got an example of that. I gave to one of the launch projects of a platform called Petri Dish, which is a platform that's specifically for faculty to solicit funds for scientific research. This particular project was run by two brothers, one of whom was a professor in the School of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell, and I believe his younger brother is a vet grad student at Yale. And they were looking at canine genomics in East Africa. And they had a fascinating series of rewards, and at the low end, which is where I was giving, it was sort of an 8.5 by 11 glossy photo of the village kids and the dogs. I guess there are packs of dogs there that have a really ancient genetic ancestry. So if you figure out what's going on genomically there, that can give you insight into current canine genomics. But what I thought was interesting and terrifying at the same time was, I believe, at the $2,500 gift level, where the deal was you gave at that level and they would actually get you a puppy from this pack and they would deliver it to you. And I was thinking, all right, so who's the grad student who gets that job, right? Like whoever did least well on their general exam is the one who's given the puppy and told, all right, here's your ticket. This needs to be delivered to Atlanta within the next 48 hours. Good luck to you.
Oh my God.
So on one level, that's completely insane. On another level, it just feels to me like there's potential there to make the research output of what we're doing tangible and personal in a way that we don't really have right now. And that's actually the kind of thing I would love to have somebody else explore themselves, and then I could learn from it instead of tackling it myself. But I can't help but be intrigued by the possibility there.
Oh, I'm right there with you.
So I'm actually encouraged. I was at the Case Summit last week and did a talk on crowdfunding there, and was encouraged by the number of people I spoke to who have pilots that are underway. I think the months or so we're actually going to start seeing a reasonable amount of data telling us what sorts of projects people give to, how much they give, what's the donor profile, stuff like that. So it feels to me like this is very much of a stay tuned for further information space, and I can promise people that Advancement Live is going to spend lots of time thinking about this, because this happens to be one of my pet topics right here.
I think the donor profile part's, at least for me, the most intriguing. Like, to see what they've looked like to us historically, and those that migrate to crowdfunding or are most engaged by it. Are there pockets that we can identify and then kind of do some data modeling off of for future fundraising? But like you said, there's a lot of research that needs to happen on it.
So let's move now to planning for the upcoming year, because I know that for many offices right now is work plan time. Joe, as your team is planning for the upcoming year, are there any opportunities or initiatives that you're particularly excited about?
Well, certainly we continue to invest time and energy as we look to get the crowdsource test off the ground here. I think I'm excited about a couple things. Trying to realign some of our approach to focus more on some of the mini campaigns, I think, that could help to see some new results. I'd like to also really, we're looking at ways that we can better educate and cultivate our young alumni and try to convey the impact, be it of participation or or unrestricted. I think that's an ongoing challenge, and we need to find fresh ways to do it. So, and then I feel like we've been able to start to really do some good, and I think some shops have been doing this for a while, to do some good testing. I think in our business we don't always do enough of that. We rely on anecdotal information, old data. Or we try to compare something that we did this year with last year when there's 1,000 circumstances that are different, a hurricane, an election, you name it. And there's a real value in some of the live testing. We've done a little bit of that this past year, which is actually helping us to make smarter decisions. And I really want to build more of that into our program.
Thanks. So, Devin, you're known in the industry as someone who has his pulse on key trends and changes in the landscape. What are some trends that you think annual giving pros need to be keeping their eye on right now?
Well, first, thanks for the kind words. Second, Joe, if I could give you a Google Hangout kiss, I would. I think
PG-rated here.
The need for testing in this industry is so just not embraced. And when testing is done, it's not a test. It's like, I'm going to send out A, and I'm going to send out watermelon, and I'm going to test them against each other, and they're not even remotely close to each other. So I'd say, like, in terms of the trends, like, I'm going to keep beating this drum, but as a field, we need to embrace core marketing 101 and maybe marketing 201 concepts so badly, and we're not. And that's not exciting or sexy for me to report on what the trends are, but it's integration, as we've said a few times, is so lacking. We're not willing to. We'll spend, as an institution, like, we'll spend tens of thousands of dollars on benchmarking with other institutions where it's apples to oranges to T-bones to Ford Mustangs, and we won't spend a cent on researching our constituents or looking at our database and really analyzing it in such a way to know why people are giving to us, why they aren't, who they want to hear from, what messages work, what do they want to, did I already say what do they want to give to? Sorry. Just the kinds of things that if we were, and I've been beating this drum a lot lately, if we were Pepsi, we would never go to market just based on our gut instinct, like Joe was saying, just like what one or two people in the office think a good soda would be. They're going to do all sorts of research, so we need to embrace that and do that. I think that in terms of what would traditionally be called trends to look at it, I still think that people are struggling to figure out, most places, not all, but most places are figuring out where they live in the mobile world in terms of, is an app right for us, or do we just need to have the right, properly enabled website for giving and engaging folks? I still think that we're losing out on monthly donors. Almost every other nonprofit sector is doing a better job of asking for and soliciting and upgrading the monthly donors than we are in higher education. I think I'll stop there, and that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, and I would echo what Devin said about the desire to do more with recurring giving. I think one of the challenges, and I feel like I hear this at peers too, which gives me some solace, and yet at the same time doesn't solve my problem, is that many are struggling with this, of how to build in more of a monthly giving approach, have the systems to do that, and so there's a lot of great opportunity. I think the other thing trying to keep an eye on is around, I know people often bring up text giving, but I think it's more, I don't think it's that. I have strong feelings there. But I think it's trying to figure out how mobile wallets, how the movement of money is going to change. I think that's where, right now it's already happening with lots of point of sale places. I use mine for my Starbucks and other places locally. But the question is, once it starts to not just be point of sale, but there's effective ways for people to give in an iTunes way. I mean, if I had to enter my credit card every time I had to buy an iTunes song, I wouldn't own that many songs. I own a lot of songs. I make lots of impulsive decisions on Amazon because I don't have to walk upstairs and get my wallet. So as those things shift, that's where I think we really need to figure out how we can stay on the cusp of that or use it effectively.
Great. So I have one final closing question for each of you. What's one resource that you would recommend to stay on top of developments in annual giving? Devin, you want to go first?
Sure. This is going to sound incredibly basic and boring, but I think the greatest, probably the two greatest things for me are still Google Alerts. Like, I live and die by those things, getting my summary stuff and getting the as they happen messages about certain key phrases in the field are great. And then totally outside of annual giving, just focusing on marketing news in general and keeping current with that. It's, again, those aren't, again, going back to my last answer, they aren't incredibly sexy answers, but they're great at just kind of both keeping me current on what's going on and kind of getting my brain churning on what should be or could be next.
Great. Thank you. Joe?
Well, if that's not a sexy answer, I have a less sexy answer to compete. For me, certainly I'm fortunate to be part of some good networks of colleagues and peers around the country at a range of schools and institutions, and I find that incredibly valuable, and I'm lucky to have that. I hope others are tapping into networks like that, because the ability to brainstorm with peers, hear trends, hear things that are working is a huge help. I want to start to branch out more into those other networks. I think that's where we don't spend enough time, is on the trends that are outside of annual giving that influence it, be it communication, marketing, you name it. I think that's where we need to spend more time out of talking to people like ourselves and talking to people that are different if we're going to approach things in different ways.
Yeah, I'd like to just really underscore both of your comments about the need to pay more attention to trends in marketing. You could argue that it's not sexy, but success is very sexy. And it feels to me that paying attention to the trends is a precondition for achieving the level of success that we're going to be able to, and to serve our institutions as best we can. My strong feeling is that we used to be able to afford to ignore things that didn't resonate with us from a staff perspective or didn't seem relevant simply because the outside world wasn't moving quite as rapidly. But I think we've really lost the initiative here, and our people simply are not in the places that they used to be doing the things they used to do. And we can pretend that's not happening, but it's going to come at a cost, and that cost is going to become more apparent over time.
Amen.
So Joe and Devin, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope the people who are viewing it live or who view the archive will find it equally stimulating. I will be back next week for Advancement Live on Tuesday at 1. Next week's show is going to deal with an issue that came up at the end of this week's show. It's going to be about fundraising and mobile devices. My guests next week are going to be Brent Grinna of Evertrue, Cornell's Keith Hannon, and Steve Rittler of Marts Systems. As always, you can watch more shows from Advancement Pros from the Advancement Live archive located at higheredlive.com. Thanks to everyone who tuned in live, and see you next week. Once again, Joe, Devin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.